Divorced my soulmate due to his depression and refusal for help, now he's thriving, and I'm left heartbroken and contemplating reconciliation. I, 35 male, divorced my husband, 36 male, 3 years ago. And God, I miss him. I asked for a divorce for a few reasons, most of which being that his depression got exponentially worse day after day and he refused to seek treatment. Sometimes he wouldn't even go into work and ended up getting fired from his job. I stayed with him for so fucking long, praying that one day he would start trying to get better. It was all I ever wanted, but that day didn't come. I sobbed the entire time signing those papers, and when I handed them to him and asked for a divorce, he just gave me the emptiest, deadest look and signed them without a word. My heart felt like it had been shattered with a hammer, anger and sadness and fear tied together in the world's tightest, ugliest knot and inset deep into my chest. I put on a brave face for my friends, tried to frame it as shackles coming off and a new beginning, but it was a lie. It just hurt, and it keeps hurting, and it will never stop hurting. He was my soulmate. I'll never love anyone like I loved him. He used to be so sweet and loving, so passionate and happy and every other wonderful thing a man could want from another. They say each day gets easier, but it isn't for me. It's been 3 years and I'm still reaching over to the other side of the bed in the morning to pull him close, and it always stings when my hands touch fabric and not his skin. It's been 3 years and I'm still expecting to see his car in the driveway when I get home from work. It's been 3 years and my heart isn't any less broken than the day he left. I've been stalking his socials, I'll admit. He's been getting back to the gym, started meds, and I see him smiling so genuinely in these photos. He looks so incredible. Maybe if I had just waited, he would have changed his mind and went to a doctor like he is now? Or was it me that held him down? Was I making it worse? I hope not. I want to go over to his place and just fall into his arms and beg him to take me back. Maybe he's wishing the same thing about me. If there's even a chance I could have my boy back, I feel like I should try. I'll never know otherwise. Edit. 1. I am a homosexual man. My husband is a homosexual man. I am not a woman. Yes, I know I'm effeminate and kind of emotional. Get creative. 2. My husband was a binge drinker. He refused treatment no matter how much I begged. We got antidepressants but he wouldn't take them. I know he started meds now because he's posted about them and his 2 years sober chip that he got last month. 3. I never stopped loving him. I never loved him any less. Near the end of our marriage, I started drinking to cope. The second I realized he was dragging me down with him, and I couldn't help him anymore. I didn't dip the second it got hard. Many of you are being kind of rude. Update 1. A few days ago, I called my ex-husband whom I divorced after 6 years when he refused to seek treatment for his depression. I called him later in the evening. It was the first time we'd spoken since a bit of trouble he'd had while he was still drinking 2.5 years ago. He picked up on the second ring. Our conversation was a little stilted at first, as to be expected, but he said he was really glad to hear from me. We ended up meeting up for coffee yesterday as so many of you suggested. I'll admit, it was kind of hard to see him, but in a good way. He looked so much better than the last time I had seen him, but he looked exactly like the man I married. He had put off a ton of weight, he gained like 75-ish pounds during his struggle with depression, and before some dick says so, I didn't leave him because of his weight gain. He looked way healthier and very put together. I'll just say it, he looked incredibly hot. What made it hard was that I couldn't kiss him hello like I used to. But God, the way his eyes lit up when he saw me, I barely needed to. We got our coffee and sat, and he updated me a little on his life in the last 3 years. What really turned his life around was in part the divorce but more so a DUI. Nobody was hurt, he was caught a few blocks from his apartment. He's since gone to rehab and AA, gotten his license back, and had to use a breathalyzer whenever he started his car for a while. He hasn't had a drop of alcohol since and I told him I was so fucking proud of him. He's also started antidepressants, and made a point of telling me that they're not SSRIs, but when I asked what that meant he got embarrassed, and told me never mind. Bottom line is that they've been helping him, he's back to being a gym rat, and he's almost completely turned his life around. This was around the point I started tearing up. It just felt so good knowing he was okay. Better than okay, he was, good /. I also apologized to him for not sticking by him. He cut me off and said I had nothing to apologize for. He was a wreck, and I was being dragged down with him. That also felt good to hear. I apologized for not contacting him much during the last 3 years. That apology, he accepted. He was dating someone for a few months, too. He broke up with him once he tried to get him to drink on New Year's. He seemed dismissive of the guy. Guess it wasn't too serious. We got up and went on a walk after a few hours, and I think we both realized it felt like a first date. I had to stop myself from trying to hold his hand at a few points, I'll admit. We ended up sitting on a bench in a nearby park, and I confessed. I told him I missed him more than anything, how I never stopped loving him, and how if he wanted to, I'd love to try again from the beginning this time. We'd go to couples therapy, keep our heads above the water, and take it slow. He was quiet for a minute before he told me something. He said he was doing better now, but there may be a time where he sunk low again. Depression isn't easily cured, and he was far from cured. He still had bad days, but he said there would be one difference. He promised he would never stop trying to improve. He was never going to give up like he did before, and refused to neglect me like he used to. If I was willing to accept that truth, he was willing to try again. I agreed, and he pulled me into an embrace and snuck a kiss to my temple. You know when it's the first warm day of spring after a cold, harsh winter, and the soft breeze and basking sun hit your skin at the same time? It felt something like that, to the 1000th degree. After a while he walked me back to my car and squeezed my hand goodbye, and the second I got inside I started sobbing like a baby. Happy tears, though. I'm currently sitting in bed, kicking my feet like a teenage girl, texting him back and forth to schedule an actual date. He said he'd plan everything, and try his best to make up for the birthdays and anniversaries he missed. He said it would knock my socks off. What a dork. I love being in love. Not gonna lie, this is gonna be a bit hard to explain to my friends and family. Not looking forward to those conversations, but right now I don't care. My man loves me. Thank you to everyone who had kind words to say, and all the people that messaged me with sympathy and advice. I hope we all find happiness, and love if we want it. Edit, we've scheduled a date for tomorrow evening. I'll let people know how it went 2 days from now in my final, unless something big happens, update. Edit 2, at his place presently. Shame me not, Reddit. I knew a woman who divorced her husband for the same reasons. They'd had 3 kids, one whom was mentally ill. Married for 25 years. Update 2. My ex-husband and I recently reconnected. He was the one taking me out, and promised that it would, in his words, knock my socks off to make up for his neglect of me. He sure as hell delivered. A little backstory, we've been together since we were 15 and 16 respectively, and have never moved out of our hometown. This year would have been our 20th anniversary, of getting together, not marriage. We were dating secretly for about 5 years before our parents caught us one day during summer break. The fallout from finding out their son was gay actually made his parents split. His dad wanted to send him away to conversion therapy. He's seen his father maybe once per year on average, and every time he's incredibly cold towards me. Would never refer to me as his son-in-law, only my husband's pal. I wonder why. Anyway, not what you're here to read. I'll get on with the lore. He picked me up from the house and wouldn't tell me where we were going, but told me to dress warmly. He ended up taking me to the place where we met, a run-down ice skating rink in our town. He used to do hockey, and I spent some time trying to learn figure skating until people started beating me up for it. Both sports would practice at the same time and I remember barely being able to keep my eyes off him. We went skating, I tried to pull off a few of the moves I remembered, he only had to catch me from falling on my ass once or twice, and I won't complain about an attractive man that I love hooking his arm around my waist, and we spent an hour or so there until our feet hurt. At one point I said that my face was getting cold, so he skated around in front of me and placed his gloved hands on my cheeks to warm me up. I just about burned a hole in the ice from how hard I was blushing, I swear to God. He wasn't done then. We left and went to dinner, specifically the restaurant where we had our first date. It's a cheap hole-in-the-wall place, seeing as we were poor teenagers when we first met. We chatted and ate food that probably took 5 years off our lives. He was an incorrigible flirt, and even held my hand underneath the table like he did all those years ago. I know I said I never stopped loving him, and I stand by that, but I think I somehow fell in love with him 1,000 times over again during that meal. At the end of dinner, he asked if I had energy for one more simple thing, to which I agreed. He took me a while out of town to a dark sky zone park, specifically the one where he proposed to me 10 years ago. He set out a blanket to sit on and another to cuddle under, and we went stargazing all bundled up together. You never know how much you miss the sound of someone's heartbeat until you haven't heard it for so long. We shared a bottle of sparkling grape juice in plastic champagne flutes and dumb, giggly kisses. It felt so similar yet so different. He told me in a moment of quiet that he loved me, and oh, God. It took everything I had not to cry. I barely hesitated before asking if he wanted to change venues. He seemed surprised, but eagerly accepted. I ended up at his place, as some of you may have seen from my edit on my second post yesterday. I wanted to take it slower than this, but it was so hard too. I was so starved of affection and hadn't been intimate with anyone for just about 6 years. I'm gonna keep what happened as between us, but all I'll say is that his medication was no issue and all of you should be jealous. I woke up in his bed this morning, reached over for him, and pulled him close just like I used to do. I haven't been this happy in a long time. We had a sleepy discussion and decided to get back together, but we're not using the term boyfriends. It just feels weird after all this time. So he's my partner, or my lover. He's mine. Update 3. It's been 2 months since my last update, and I can't believe how much has changed. My partner and I have settled into a rhythm that feels both familiar and entirely new. The first few weeks were a delicate dance of rediscovery. We'd spend evenings at each other's places, cooking dinner together and talking until the early hours. Sometimes we'd fall into comfortable silence, him reading a book while I worked on my laptop, just existing in the same space again. Those quiet moments felt almost more intimate than anything else. Last month, we decided to take a weekend trip to the coast. It was the first time we'd traveled together since before the divorce, and I was nervous about spending 48 uninterrupted hours together. What if we ran out of things to say? What if his depression resurfaced and I didn't know how to handle it? My worries were completely unfounded. We spent the days walking along the beach, collecting shells like we used to when we were teenagers. One evening, as the sun was setting, he pulled me close and whispered, "I never thought I'd get to do this with you again." I felt that familiar ache in my chest, but this time it was sweet rather than painful. That night in our hotel room, he showed me something he'd been keeping from me. A journal. He'd started it during his recovery, documenting his darkest thoughts but also his progress. He handed it to me with trembling hands. "You don't have to read it all," he said. "But I want you to understand where I've been." I stayed up most of the night reading his words, tears streaming down my face. The raw honesty of his struggle, the depth of his pain, and his determination to climb out of that darkness, it was all there on the page. There were entries about me too, about how much he missed me and how he didn't blame me for leaving. The next morning, we had our first real fight since getting back together. I was upset that he hadn't shared more of his journey with me, and he was defensive about needing to process things in his own way. For a terrifying moment, I thought we were falling back into old patterns. But then something amazing happened. Instead of shutting down like he used to, he took a deep breath and asked if we could talk it through. We sat on the balcony of our room, facing the ocean, and had the most honest conversation we've ever had. He explained that he was afraid of burdening me with his darkness again, and I admitted my fear of not being able to help him if things got bad. "I'm not the same person I was," he promised. "And neither are you. We're going to mess up, but I'm never going back to that place where I stopped trying." We came back from that trip stronger than before. Last week, we had our first session with a couples therapist. It was uncomfortable and awkward at times, but also incredibly validating. Our therapist pointed out that we're essentially building a new relationship on the foundation of our old one, keeping what worked and being mindful of what didn't. Yesterday, I was going through some old boxes and found our wedding rings. I sat on the floor of my closet, holding them in my palm, remembering the day we exchanged them. Without thinking too much about it, I slipped mine on. It still fit perfectly. When he came over for dinner, he noticed it immediately. His eyes widened, and for a second I thought I'd made a terrible mistake. But then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his own ring. "I've been carrying it around for weeks," he confessed. "Waiting for the right moment. We're not rushing back into marriage. We both agree that we need more time to rebuild what we lost, but wearing these rings feels right, a symbol not of what was, but of what could be again." This morning, I woke up to find him already awake, watching me with that soft smile I used to dream about during our years apart. When I asked what he was thinking, he kissed my forehead and said, "I'm thinking about moving day." I must have looked confused because he laughed and explained, "My lease is up next month. And this back and forth thing is exhausting. We haven't decided whose place we'll choose, or if we'll find somewhere new altogether." But the thought of waking up beside him every morning, of building a home together again, it feels like the most natural thing in the world. I know we still have challenges ahead. His depression isn't gone, it's managed. There will be bad days mixed with the good. But this time, we're facing everything together, eyes wide open, with all the wisdom our pain has taught us. Update 4. It's been 6 months since my last update, and I'm writing this from our new place. Yes, our place. We decided neither of his apartment nor mine felt right for our fresh start, so we found a small house with a yard just outside of town. Moving day came and went with surprising ease, perhaps because we had so many friends eager to help. They've all come around to us being together again, even the ones who were skeptical at first. The house needed work, which turned out to be exactly what we needed. Weekends spent painting walls and assembling furniture gave us a shared project to pour ourselves into. He's surprisingly handy, something I'd forgotten during our time apart. Last weekend, I caught him installing shelves in what will eventually be our home office, concentration etched on his face as he measured twice, cut once. It was such a simple moment, but it hit me with unexpected force. This is what healing looks like. We've kept up with our couples therapy, going every other week. Our therapist says we're making remarkable progress, though there are still moments when old wounds resurface. Last month, he had a particularly bad depressive episode that lasted nearly a week. I found myself tensing, waiting for him to push me away like he used to. But this time was different. "I need you to know I'm struggling," he told me one evening, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm taking my meds, I called my therapist, and I'm not going anywhere." Those words meant everything. We got through it together, me giving him space when he needed it, him reaching for my hand when the darkness felt too heavy. By the end of the week, I realized something profound. I wasn't exhausted. In our previous life together, his bad days would drain me completely. This time, I was tired but whole. His father called last week, which was unexpected. Their relationship has been strained for decades, ever since his parents discovered we were together as teenagers. The conversation was brief and awkward, but his father asked if he could visit sometime. My partner was quiet after hanging up, and I didn't push. Later that night, he told me he wasn't sure if he was ready to let his father back in, but he was considering it. Growth happens in all directions, I suppose. We celebrated his 3-year sobriety milestone last month. I organized a small gathering at our new place, just a few close friends who've supported his journey. He seemed embarrassed by the attention at first, but by the end of the night, I caught him smiling to himself as he collected empty plates from the living room. "I never thought I'd have this again," he said when everyone had left. "A home. You. A future worth staying sober for." Our wedding rings have found a new home, not on our fingers, but in a small wooden box on our dresser. We've talked about marriage again, but we're in no rush. What we have now feels more solid than any legal document could make it. Yesterday, we were grocery shopping when an elderly woman stopped us in the produce section. "How long have you two been together?" she asked with a warm smile. Without missing a beat, my partner answered, 20 years, with a brief intermission. We all laughed, but later I found myself thinking about his answer. 20 years. Despite everything, despite the divorce and the years apart, in his mind, we've never stopped being us. Last night, I woke around 3 a.m. to find his side of the bed empty. For a split second, old fears gripped me. Had he left? Was he drinking somewhere? I found him in the kitchen, making tea and scrolling through his phone. He looked up when I entered, immediately reading the concern on my face. "Couldn't sleep," he explained, putting his phone down. "Didn't want to wake you with my tossing and turning." I sat with him until he finished his tea, neither of us saying much. As we walked back to bed, he stopped in the hallway and pulled me into a tight embrace. "Thank you for calling me that day," he whispered against my hair. "Thank you for giving us another chance." I held him just as tightly, thinking about all the parallel universes where I never made that call, where we continued our separate lives, carrying the weight of what might have been. How lucky I am to be in this universe instead. We're not the same people who fell in love as teenagers, or even the same people who married years later. We're not the broken men who signed divorce papers 3 years ago. We're something new, scarred but stronger, cautious but hopeful, older but somehow more alive than ever. Update 5. It's been nearly a year since my last update, and as I sit here on our back porch watching the first signs of spring emerge in our garden, I can hardly believe how far we've come. Winter was challenging. My partner's depression tends to worsen with the shorter days, and I found myself watching for signs of withdrawal, preparing for the worst. But he surprised me. Before the season even began, he talked to his doctor about adjusting his medication and increased his therapy sessions. He bought one of those light therapy lamps and set up a strict routine, morning workouts, regular sleep schedule, daily walks even in the cold. There were still hard days. A week in January where he barely spoke, his eyes carrying that distant look I've learned to recognize. But unlike before, he didn't disappear into himself completely. "I'm having a rough time," he'd say, "but I'm working through it." And he was. I'd find him journaling, meditating, or sometimes just sitting quietly with a cup of tea, fighting his own battles but never shutting me out. His father visited in November. I offered to make myself scarce for the day, but my partner insisted I stay. "You're my family," he said simply. The reunion was awkward at first, stilted conversation over coffee, careful avoidance of certain topics. But by dinner, something had shifted. His father asked about our life together, actually listened to the answers. Before leaving, he pulled me aside and thanked me for bringing his son back. I didn't correct him to say that his son had fought his way back himself. Some bridges take time to rebuild. We celebrated our 1-year re-anniversary in February, marking the day we decided to try again. I planned a quiet evening at home, cooking his favorite meal. He walked in with a small wrapped package. Inside was a key, not to our house, but to a cabin by the lake where we used to spend summers when we were younger. He'd rented it for a week in July. "I thought we could make new memories there," he said. "Or maybe reclaim some of the old ones." Last month, we had our first real crisis. His company announced layoffs, and he was among those let go. 3 years ago, this would have sent him spiraling. I braced myself, waiting for the fallout. Instead, he allowed himself one day to be angry and disappointed, then got to work updating his resume. He's been interviewing steadily, and while nothing has panned out yet, his resilience amazes me. Yesterday, he even mentioned starting his own business, something he'd dreamed about before depression stole his confidence. "Would you support me if I tried?" he asked, uncertainty flickering across his face. "With everything I have," I promised. "We've started talking about renewing our vows, not right away, but someday." The wooden box with our rings has moved from the dresser to the nightstand, a little closer each month. Sometimes I catch him looking at it, a small smile playing on his lips. 2 weeks ago, we hosted a dinner party, our first since getting back together. As I watched him move around the kitchen, laughing with our friends, pouring drinks, sparkling water for himself, 3 years sober and counting, I was struck by how ordinary and extraordinary it all was. This comfortable domesticity we've rebuilt from the ashes of what we lost. Later that night, after everyone had gone, he found me washing dishes and wrapped his arms around me from behind. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Calling me that day?" I turned to face him, hands still soapy. "Not for a single second. Even with all the work we've had to do? All the therapy and talking and figuring things out? I thought about the alternative, a lifetime of reaching for someone who wasn't there, of wondering what might have been. Especially because of all that, I told him. The work is what makes it real this time." This morning, I woke before him and watched the sunrise paint our bedroom in soft gold. He stirred beside me, eyes fluttering open, and immediately reached for my hand. "I had a dream about us," he murmured, voice still thick with sleep. "We were old men, sitting on a porch somewhere. You were complaining about your knees, and I was pretending I could still hear you properly." "Sounds about right," I laughed. "It was nice," he continued, more serious now. "Knowing we made it that far together. I squeezed his hand. We will. The road ahead isn't perfectly smooth. His depression isn't cured, just managed. My own anxieties still flare up sometimes. We're both works in progress, learning and relearning how to love each other better, but I'm no longer afraid of the hard days. We've weathered worse storms and found our way back to each other. Update 6. It's March 2025, and I'm sitting in our garden watching the first flowers push through the soil. 2 years since my last update, and sometimes I still can't believe this is my life. Last summer, we finally renewed our vows. It wasn't a grand affair, just us, a handful of friends, and a justice of the peace in the backyard of our little house. My partner insisted on writing his own vows, which made me nervous. I've always been the one with the words between us. But when the moment came, he pulled out a worn piece of paper and read the most beautiful promises I've ever heard. I vow to never stop trying, he said, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes. To never again mistake my darkness for who I am. To remember that loving you is both a choice and a privilege I make every morning. His business venture took off last year, a small consulting firm helping companies create better mental health resources for their employees. He speaks openly about his own journey now, turning his struggle into something that helps others. Last month, he was invited to speak at a conference, and I watched from the audience as he commanded the room, sharing his story without shame. The standing ovation he received brought tears to my eyes. His father passed away unexpectedly in December. It hit him harder than either of us expected, all those unresolved feelings suddenly having nowhere to go. He flew home for the funeral alone, his choice, and returned quieter than I'd seen him in years. For a week, I worried we were sliding backward. But then one evening, he sat me down and showed me a letter his father had written him shortly before his death. In it, his father apologized for the years of rejection and expressed pride in the man my partner had become. He never said any of this to my face, my partner told me, voice thick with emotion. But at least I know he felt it. The grief process hasn't been linear, but he's working through it. His therapist says it's actually healthy, mourning the relationship he wished he'd had while acknowledging the complicated one he did have. We celebrated 4 years of his sobriety last month. 4 years. Sometimes I catch myself holding my breath when he's having a bad day, waiting for him to reach for a bottle that isn't there. Old habits die hard. But he hasn't slipped once, not even after his father's death when it would have been so easy to numb the pain. Last week, we had dinner with a couple we've become friends with, 2 women who've been together for nearly 30 years. As we were leaving, the older of the 2 pulled me aside. You know what I see when I look at you 2? She asked. I see me and Diane 20 years ago, after we almost lost each other. That same grateful tenderness, hold on to it. I promised her I would. This morning, I found my partner in the kitchen making breakfast, humming to himself. He didn't notice me watching from the doorway, taking in the domesticity of the moment. The sunlight through the window caught on his wedding ring. Yes, we're wearing them again, and sent little prisms dancing across the wall. What? He asked when he finally spotted me. Nothing, I said. Just loving you. He smiled that smile that still makes my heart skip after all these years. Come here, then. As I moved into his arms, I thought about that elderly woman from the grocery store years ago, asking how long we'd been together. 22 years now, with that brief intermission. 22 years of loving the same man through different versions of ourselves. His depression still visits sometimes. There are mornings when he wakes up and I can see in his eyes that the day will be a battle. But now he has tools, medication that works, a support system. And most importantly, he has hope, something I wasn't sure he'd ever find again. Yesterday, we were sorting through some old boxes and found a photo album from our first years together. 2 teenagers with terrible haircuts and bright eyes, arms thrown around each other like we were afraid the world might try to pull us apart. In a way, it did. But here we are. We made it, he whispered, tracing a finger over our younger faces. Yes, we did. Through darkness and light, through separation and reunion, through all the messy, beautiful complications of loving another human being for half our lives. My man loves me, and I love him. The rest we figure out one day at a time.